Me too, Chris. Me too. Okay, everybody, welcome back from the holidays. We're doing Matthew today. Before we dive in, and I'm going to record this. Nobody emailed me, but I'm just going to do it just in case so we have it. Anything you want to talk about Matthew before we dive back into Sermon on the Mount and get the gears going again? Go ahead, Chris.
Being brought up for 14 years in Catholic schools, actually 15, 1 year at college, I never thought I knew anything about the Bible. Well, it turns out I know everything about Matthew.
Yeah.
That as I read today, it was just amazing. It's like I've heard all this stuff before, but none of the other parts of the Bible really little hedgy familiar, but not much. But
Yeah.
Matthew, my goodness.
The Catholic Bible. When I went to seminary, all the Catholics were that was their gospel was Matthew. Yeah. Go ahead, Bernie.
I've asked this question before, but I don't remember the answer. Why is it that the Lord's Prayer is different in the Catholic Church?
Yeah.
It doesn't have the "For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever."
Yeah.
I thought it wasn't in our Bible, but it is in our Bible. Is it not in the Catholic Bible?
It is the it happened during post-Reformation split. And it was actually so when the Reformation happened and the division occurred, it was actually the Anglican Church that added that piece, and then the rest of the Protestants adopted it. So that's the difference. And it came from the Anglicans wanting to do that. And there's a rumor that it was a Henry VIII thing that he wanted to put his spin on it. So he's the one that added it. But most people think that it was what was his name? The guy who wrote the Book of Worship. I'm blanking on his name, but that he was the one.
Wolsey?
It wasn't Wolsey, because Wolsey was the Catholic that was prior to him. It starts with a C. Kramer? It might have been Kramer. It was the Archbishop Kramer.
Okay, now, okay, so it's been added to the prayer, but it wasn't added to the Bible. It was in the Bible,
right,
to start with, right? Okay.
Yeah.
So this is very familiar, and apparently it's the same as Luke, but which came first?
Matthew. So Mark comes first, but the Lord's Prayer is not in Mark.
No, but I mean this passage that we read, a lot of it's very familiar.
Matthew. And everything in Matthew should feel familiar to any of you who did the Mark study. Because remember, Matthew just took 90% of Mark and moved.
Okay, that's what I knew you told us. I just couldn't remember. So, and then Luke, how did he get involved?
So Luke comes after Matthew, and he's going to do the same thing. He's going to take Mark, but he's going to take a little less of it. And so whereas Matthew's going to really, what's different about Matthew is he's going to have the discipleship piece. He's going to have really Jesus as the teacher, the big teaching sermons. If you remember back to Luke, that's the spirit gospel where Jesus, there's more stories about spirituality. There's lots more about our relationship with money. A lot of Luke added a bunch of parables about money. And again, Matthew's writing for one community and Luke's writing for a very different community, but they both take Mark's core and then run with it.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Go ahead, Diane.
Where did the term Gentile come from? Because I know Matthew is the Jews of all the Jews, and he is, to me, preaching to the Jews and has not very much good to say about Gentiles, isn't including them the way Paul did in his letters, right?
Right. So,
what does the word mean?
Yeah. I believe it, and I'll check this, but I believe it comes from the Jewish term for a non-Jew. So Matthew is really going to focus on, though we see just a little bit of it opening up in this piece we're going to cover today, but he's really going to laser focus on the Jewish community. And it's not until the very end that Matthew is going to go broad and say, no, this is for everyone, all of it, right? So it doesn't happen till the very end where Matthew goes broad, and he's the only one that'll do it in the Gospels, and they call it the Great Commissioning, and that's how he will end his Gospel.
Okay, all right.
And that Great Commissioning is very similar to what you'll find in those Paul letters. Yeah.
Okay.
You guys are like way sharper than I am after post break, man. I swear I'm not firing on all cylinders yet.
We didn't have as much to do as you did during the
That's right.
holidays.
We just sort of sat back and enjoyed it.
Yeah, I don't think I wrote any sermons or worried about anything, just showed up. Kind of.
I will tell you, there is nothing like 11:30 p.m. on a Christmas Eve tired. That is a very unique tired. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and we'll dive in here. Okay, let's get back into Matthew. Okay, this week we are up to chapter 6 and 9. A reminder, we're going all the way through right before Lent starts. So Lent's early this year. It starts on February 14th is Ash Wednesday. We're going to finish up Matthew before then. Okay, here's what's happened so far. Birth narratives, escape into Egypt. The family went back to Nazareth. He got baptized. That's actually the topic of this Sunday sermon. He's going to be tested. He was tested in the wilderness. He started to preach, and then he calls his disciples, and he started to heal. And we just started the Sermon on the Mount. So remember, the Sermon on the Mount is 3 whole chapters of Matthew. So a big chunk. We've only done one of them. Jesus is going to do a ton of healing. He's going to calm a storm. We're going to hear about true and false disciples and prophets, and we're going to talk about that somewhat today and put that in ancient context too. Jesus is going to call Matthew, and we're going to talk about the tradition behind whether or not that was the Matthew who wrote the story. And then he's going to raise the dead girl and heal a sick woman. Okay. So let's dive back into the Sermon on the Mount. We did chapter 5 the last time we were together. So this time we're going to do chapter 6. And I'm just going to pull out some of the big teachings. And I pulled out some of the teachings that either I haven't preached on or we haven't really talked about much. So will someone take this one to read it?
I will.
Thanks, Chris.
Okay, be careful not to practice your righteousness in front of others to be seen by them. If you do, you will have no reward from your Father in heaven. So when you give to the needy, do not announce it with trumpets, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and on the streets, to be honored by others. Truly, I tell you, they have received their reward in full. But when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret. Then your Father, who sees that is done in secret, will reward you.
Okay, so we're talking about piety, which is how you practice your faith. That's the other word for piety. And in piety, he's talking about almsgiving, donating to the church, prayer and fasting, activities that demonstrate an individual's sincerity in their spirituality. And he's saying that these types of acts need to be conducted in right relationship with God, meaning the reason you do them is out of this connection with God. You don't do them because of how they're viewed by others. You don't do them because of how they make you feel. You don't do them because you feel obligated. You do them because you are in right relationship with God. And when we are in right relationship with God, it makes sense to to share our resources. It makes sense to have spiritual practice that connect us into that right relationship. So that's what he's saying, right? So he's saying basically before God, all hearts are open, no secrets hidden. God knows everything. And he's really calling on his Jewish readers to avoid attention and hypocrisy, right? So you could put this in a contemporary understanding of, you know, the Jeff Bezos and his ex-wife, right? His ex-wife got half of that fortune and has been very quietly funneling it to organizations around the world, very committed to giving it away, lives very simply. You don't hear about her in the news, but is consistently changing the game for small nonprofits doing good in the world. Jeff Bezos, when he donates money, there's always a press release and there's typically a story. You'll hear about it on the news. So Matthew's saying, be like Jeff Bezos' ex-wife. Do it on the down low, keep quiet. Again, with the Sermon on the Mount, there's nothing about what to believe. So there's nothing here about what to believe. It's all focused on what to do with our actions. Okay, let's take another one about prayer. Somebody want to read that one?
I will.
Thanks, Dan.
And when you pray, do not be like the hypocrites, for they love to pray, standing in the synagogues and on the street corners to be seen by others. Truly, I tell you, they have received their reward in full. But when you pray, go into your room, close the door, and pray to your Father, who is unseen. Then your Father, who sees what is done in secret, will reward you. And when you pray, do not keep on babbling like pagans, for they think they will be heard because of their many words. Do not be like them, for your Father knows what you need before you ask him. This, then, is how you should pray.
Okay, and then he'll go right into the Lord's Prayer, right? So again, we already started talking about this one. It's here and it's in Luke. It was recited in public schools in this country until 1961. It is one of the earliest prayers, and the Didache, which is the earliest Christian tool that we have, teaching tool, included this prayer. So we know this prayer was a part of early Christian worship and preparation from the very, very beginning. It's set up as a prayer that should be repeated. And it is a prayer that really draws on the Jewish prayer practice at the time. It's set up very similar to the Jewish prayers at the time, including that Our Father. And if you do the translation work on that, it basically means something like Abba or Father Dearest. Really, that prayer, the Our Father, is an outline of Jesus's theology. So if you wanted to encapsulate Jesus' theology in a little 6 sentences, 6 bullets, you could find it right in there. There are a lot of political undertones in the prayer, from addressing God as Father, that intimacy of relationship, to the desire for God's kingdom. So, and, you know, you think about the time of trial, words that show up. Matthew's audience was, we're going to talk about this a little later. It was very difficult to be an early Christian, very, very difficult. So we're going to talk about what it was like there. Okay, let's keep going with piety practices on chapter 6. Paul, you want to read that one?
Sure. Therefore, I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat or drink, or about your body, what you will wear. It's not life more than food, and the body more than clothes? Look at the birds of the air. They do not sow or reap or store away in barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are they not much more valuable than they? Are you not much more valuable than they? Can any one of you, by worrying, add a single hour to your life? Therefore, do not worry, about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself, and each day has enough trouble of its own. Amen.
Good one for the new year, right?
Yes.
Okay. So what he's saying is heavenly treasures are more valuable than earthly treasures because they're going to last longer. And loving God is more important than piling up wealth. And that there is no need to worry about all the things that we worry about because God is going to take care of all of that. And what Matthew is doing through Jesus's words is urging those followers to trust and serve God. So this teaching, I think at the time, all the way up to current times, is pretty countercultural in terms of not focusing on monetary possessions, right? So there's been a lot of debate over the centuries of whether or not these types of teachings, and this is one of many very, very difficult teachings in the Sermon Mount, whether or not they can actually be practiced in real life. Okay. Okay, chapter 7. Let's talk a little bit about the narrow gate. Enter through the narrow gate, for the wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it. Okay, so a little bit, I want to talk a little bit about Jesus as a wisdom teacher, because this is a little piece of wisdom, right? He's talking about a spiritual path. And we've talked about this in different ways as, you know, the way. It was pretty unconventional. It was the road less traveled. It was a narrow path. It is countercultural. It is not the path that we tend to go down. It's not the easy path, right? Matthew is going to use kind of terminologies around death and resurrection as this metaphor for spiritual renewal. So we're going to start to encounter that more. It's kind of dying to that old identity, being born into a new identity. That new identity, again, centered upon repentance, but the good understanding of the word, radical centering in God. And a lot of what those of you that did the Paul class with me should hear are echoes of Paul, which makes a lot of sense if you think back to what I told you that maybe best guess is Matthew's writing is in Antioch, which is where Paul set up one of his churches. So it makes sense that a lot of what you will start to hear in Matthew is going to kind of match up with what you might have heard in Paul. Okay, chapter 7. We're going to talk about false prophets here. Somebody want to read this one?
I will.
Thanks, Chris.
Okay, watch out for false prophets. They come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ferocious wolves. By their fruit you will recognize them. Do people pick grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? Likewise, every good tree bears. I'm having a problem with one of my eyes, so sorry about that. Likewise, every good tree bears good fruit, but a bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, and a bad tree cannot bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Thus, by their fruit, you will recognize them. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. Many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name drive out demons, and in your name perform many miracles? Then I will tell them plainly, I never knew you. Away from me, you evildoers.
Okay, so let's talk about false prophets. because this is a big problem that we definitely heard a lot of. So I'm going to show you some of the ways that Paul talked about this. Remember, Paul writes first, right? So the first letters in chronological order in the New Testament are Paul's letters. And he is writing anywhere from 15 to 30 years after Jesus dies. It's before Mark. And we know at that point in time, there was clearly issues around who had the proper teaching and the right message, because we see it in Paul's letters, right? So Paul's clearly worried about this. In Galatians, he's saying, now I say again, if anyone is preaching you a gospel contrary to one you received, let him be accursed. In Corinthians, he's calling even Satan disguised himself as an angel of light, right? He's saying false apostles, deceitful workmen, disguising themselves as apostles of Christ. That was 2 Corinthians. Romans, by smooth talk and flattery, they deceive the hearts of the simple-minded. And it's not just for the early Christians. This was an issue for Judaism as well. So this is from Deuteronomy. If the word does not come to pass or come true, that is a word the Lord has not spoken. The prophet has spoken it presumptuously. You need not be afraid of him. Jeremiah, they are prophesying to you a lying vision, worthless divination, and the deceit of their own minds. Okay. So the question is about this piece that we first have here that Chris read from chapter 7, and watching out for false process. Is this Matthew? Is it Jesus? Or is it just life around the year 80 CE, right? So we know issues around false prophets are part of the Hebrew tradition, that they've struggled with that. We know that it was going on in Paul's letter. So it was happening 30 to 40 years before Matthew was written. And we know that it was accelerating. We have a good idea what the early first century was like. There were tons of itinerant preachers who were traveling around, attempting to teach the gospel of Christ. There's no standardized theology. There's no New Testament, right? There's just scattered copies of Paul's letters and Mark's gospels. That's it, right? And so Matthew is warning against all of these kind of charismatic types who may work miracles, and Jesus wasn't the only miracle worker. But they don't just observe that day-to-day moral demands, right? So you may be a miracle worker, but if you aren't living up to the teachings in the Sermon on the Mount, that would make you a false prophet. So Matthew's saying there's a difference between hearing and doing. Mm-hmm. And remember, it was pretty tough being an early Christian. So the earliest followers of Christ, they were known to be pretty strange, right? So the Romans refused to recognize them as a formal religion. They weren't recognized until Constantine deals with that 3 centuries from now. The reason the Romans thought they were so strange, and the Jews were, so up until the destruction of the temple, the Jews were recognized as a religion. Early Christians were not. Again, they weren't even using the term Christians, right? Mm-hmm. So because they refused to acknowledge the Roman Empire as a lord, and they refused to be a member of the military. So they really did kind of stand out. They were viewed by almost every group they encountered as other, as weird. There were rumors that they indulged in orgies, they practiced infanticide, and even cannibalism. So a lot of the misunderstandings about the earliest communion led to these perceptions of cannibalism. They had no societal power. And again, they were a very, very tiny minority within a very, very tiny minority. So it was tough to be an early Christian. And some of that comes through in the stuff that Matthew's talking about. Okay, let's talk about a little bit about healing, and let's go on from the Sermon on the Mount to chapter 8. Someone read that one? Thanks, Paul. Oh, you're on mute still.
There we go. When Jesus came down from the mountainside, large crowds followed him. A man with leprosy came and knelt before him and said, Lord, if you are willing, can you make me clean? Jesus reached out his hand and touched the man. I am willing, he said, be clean. Immediately he was cleaned of his leprosy. Then Jesus said to him, see that you don't tell anyone, but go, show yourself to the priest and offer the gift Moses commanded as a testimony to them.
Thanks, Paul.
Sure.
Okay, so the first thing Jesus is going to do once he finishes the Sermon on the Mount is a healing, and he's going to heal an untouchable. So so there's the chunk of teaching where he starts his ministry, he calls his disciples, all of that. Then we head right into the Sermon on the Mount. The next few chapters, this next block of teaching, are all about putting teaching into practice, about living out the Sermon on the Mount on the street. So again, we've talked a little bit about this before, but leprosy meant not only the sickness and disfigurement, but it was social banishment. So it was believed to be highly contagious. So these were isolated individuals. And the healing that was needed here was not only physical healing, but this reintegration into society. So with this leper, Jesus is restoring and making that connection with the Sermon on the Mount, living it out. Now, right after this story, he's going to heal a centurion, a Roman, and a Gentile. So this is one of the examples after this one where you're starting to see Matthew just inching out of that Jewish-centric focus that is really going to come to fruition once Jesus is resurrected. Okay, let's talk about priorities. So will someone read chapter 8? Or Diane, would you read this one?
Sure. When Jesus saw the crowd around him, he gave orders to cross to the other side of the lake. Then a teacher of the law came to him and said, Teacher, I will follow you wherever you go. Jesus replied, Foxes have dens and birds have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head. Another disciple said to him, Lord, first let me go and bury my father. But Jesus told him, Follow me and let the dead bury their own dead. Then he got into the boat and his disciples followed him. Suddenly, a furious storm came up on the lake so that the waves swept over the boat, but Jesus was sleeping. The disciples went and woke him, saying, Lord, save us, we're going to drown. He replied, You of little faith, why are you so afraid? Then he got up and rebuked the winds and the waves, and it was completely calm. The men were amazed and asked, What kind of man is this? Even the winds and the waves obey him.
Thanks, Diane. Okay, so that first part, that's really like verbatim from Mark. And then the let me go and bury my dead part is new with Matthew. The storm part is almost verbatim from Mark. The difference we're going to see with Matthew is Matthew's going to have 2 storm stories. And we're going to encounter the second one because in the second one, it's not a storm story per se, but they're out on the boat. That's the one where Peter's going to walk to him. So this is just the regular storm story one. So let's talk about this thing that he adds here, which is the I'm gonna come with you, but I gotta go bury my father. And Jesus is saying, no, you follow me first. You're not gonna go bury your father, right? So within Jewish tradition, when a man's father dies, it is his obligation to give that man, his father, a proper funeral before anything else, before everything else. That is the son's obligation to make sure that occurs, right? So this would have been incredibly shocking for Matthew's Jewish audience, right? Really like in your face, drop your jaw teaching for Matthew's audience. because it was so contrary to the ancient context with which they would have heard it, right? But what is happening is Matthew's stressing how critical this message and teaching is, that it would take priority over everything, including the one thing that you, as a Jewish man, believe you have got to do in life, right? More important than that. It's also, this section is setting up Jesus's authority, that it is, right, more important to follow him and his teachings than burying your dead. And that's going to go right into the story of calming the storm. So we've talked a little bit about these storm ones before. In ancient Jewish writings, the sea is that place of darkness and evil, threatening and wild. In his calming of the sea, challenges his disciples to believe that he is beyond a teacher and a healer, that he has powers that are quite remarkable. Okay, let's talk about Matthew. Chapter 9. As Jesus went on from there, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at the tax collector's booth. Follow me, he told him. And Matthew got up and followed him. While Jesus was having dinner at Matthew's house, many tax collectors and sinners came and ate with him and his disciples. When the Pharisees saw this, they asked his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" On hearing this, Jesus said, It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. But go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice, for I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners. That right there, so that why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners? Lucia made me a special cup with that on it. It's my favorite mug in the world. I keep it in the office. It says eats with tax collectors and sinners. So the big message of this one is that the Jesus movement does not look like what folks expected, right? Now, for centuries, tradition had it that this Matthew, because this is a unique story to Matthew, this is the Matthew who wrote the Gospel of Matthew. That's the tradition. We know now that this was probably, the Gospel of Matthew was written 50 to 60 years after Jesus died. And so it's at least 2 generations separating that Matthew from this Matthew. But for a long time, this is why that the Gospel of Matthew is attributed to a tax collector. It's because of this story. Okay, so life as a tax collector. Life as a tax collector, they had to collaborate with the Roman authorities. So they were basically a tool of the empire. It was very common that tax collectors would also keep a little extra for themselves. They had an awful, awful reputation. It was an isolated, lonely, often hated, rightly so, occupation, right? So then you have somebody who is a tax collector who is being greeted by someone who welcomed him, saw him, and wanted to spend time with him, right? Invited him to dinner and then invited and ate with his friends, right? So when we think about healing, this is a great story to think about a really broad understanding of what healing is, what Jesus's healing ministry was, because this is somebody who was so on the outs. And what does he do? He sees him, he greets him, he invites him to dinner, he spends time with him, right? So when you think about healing, don't just think about the stories of the leper, but think about the stories of Matthew, the tax collector. It's a pretty powerful one. Okay, so let's talk a little bit. We're going to talk a little bit about the Samaritan, or the bleeding woman and the child who dies. This is a story lifted in its entirety from Mark. Will someone read this one?
I will.
Thanks, Chris.
Okay, while he was saying this, a synagogue leader came and knelt before him and said, "My daughter has just died, but come and put your hand on her, and she will live. Jesus got up and went with him, and so did his disciples. Just then, a woman who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years came up behind him and touched the edge of his cloak. She said to herself, "If I only touch his cloak, I will be healed." Jesus turned and saw her. "Take heart, daughter," he said. "Your faith has healed you." And the woman was healed at that moment. When Jesus entered the synagogue leader's house and saw the noisy crowd and people playing pipes, he said, "Go away. The girl is not dead, but asleep." But they laughed at him. After the crowd had been put outside, he went in and took the girl by the hand, and she got up. News of this spread through all of that region.
Okay, so again, completely lifted from Mark. So we've worked with this story before. The reason why, Matthew always has a choice about what to keep and what to throw out. He does throw stuff out. But Matthew's writing for a Jewish audience, right? In both of these two instances, Jesus is breaking the purity laws of the time. He's touching a menstruating woman, and he's touching a corpse. What should have happened is, by both of those actions, Jesus would have been unclean in that ancient context and in Matthew's context. And what he should do is bathe himself and his clothes. That was what should have happened. So if you think back to that conversation we had where I showed you the Jewish baths, he should have gone through the ritual cleaning after this, right? So a lot of odd things are happening here that will probably really confuse Matthew's Jewish audience. The woman's uncleanliness does not affect him. He holds the dead child's hand and she gets up, right? So there's a lot of odd things that are happening here in this story. But at the end of the day, he's going to heal both of them, regardless of the purity laws or requirements of the time. And he's going to go forth into his ministry from there. Okay. So I'm not going to break us up because we have a pretty small group today, but I want to spend some time having this conversation. The Sermon on the Mount. There is teachings in there on, we talked about the piety stuff today and the prayer practices. Last week, we talked about some of the stuff around creative resistance, not condoning violence, but finding ways to deal with it. I know you've heard me preach on the forgiveness pieces. There's a lot in the Sermon on the Mount that's really, really tough. Again, it's not beliefs. It's about how to live in this world and be in right relationship with God. So the question that has been plaguing many people through the centuries is, can that be lived out in real life? Is it possible to live according to the Sermon on the Mount? So let me stop sharing here and turn that down. Okay, so the question is, can we live? Is it possible to achieve life as Jesus taught in the Sermon on the Mount? And if not, why not? And if so, how? Thoughts?
Well, there's a lot of verbiage in the Sermon on the Mount of, that I don't know if Jesus said it. I personally believe it was probably said more simply. So if you take each piece of the Sermon on the Mount, you can, because the way it is in Matthew is, don't worry about anything. God will provide everything for you, right? Don't worry about money, or that God will provide, which is, not what I believe, that God will provide that way. But the core of it, and I'll have to go over it again, is that if you don't worry about keeping all your stuff or everything you have to have, and you just share, and you go out in the world doing whatever you can for injustice and all that, that will bring you the kingdom of God on earth. That will bring you the joy and the love. So yes, we can, not exactly with the verbiage we hear, because it's scary. You don't worry about earning money or anything. The birds, you don't need clothes. The birds, God takes care of it. But the core of it all, you can. It's very difficult, and it won't be every single moment of my life doing it. But the core of it can be done.
Okay. Other thoughts? Go ahead, Paul.
I got to unmute. Okay. So I would agree. I would put it a little differently. I don't think you should take this literally. I think there are real positive thoughts in here to live by that will really help you in life. But I don't think it's literal. I think it's impractical to not worry about anything. I'm sorry, but I just think that's impractical. So, but on a different level, you shouldn't worry about anything. I mean, does that make any sense to anybody? I mean,
it does to me. I'm on your side, Paul.
And so, there's a lot of wisdom here, and I do think it's the way to live. It's just a little tricky.
Yeah, it's a lot tricky, huh?
Right.
Especially trying to bring it forward from that time to current. You have to manipulate that around a lot.
Bernie or Marilee, thoughts?
I'm sitting here nodding at the last statement. We're talking about 2,000 years ago, and there's been a lot of change in the world, in society, in humanity since then.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, no,
a lot more of it around too.
Yeah, I agree with you.
I think we have changed as a society, but it's just always, then something happens like what's going on in the Middle East now, and I think we haven't learned anything. We haven't changed anything. We're right back where we were. And eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, and nobody's learned that war doesn't ever win anything. It doesn't ever accomplish anything. So I don't think the world has changed as much as it needs to.
Yeah.
But at least there's a lot more people that thinks this is the right way. This is the right direction anyway.
Yeah. Dan?
Yeah, but for me, I have to then bring all of this back to my life and what I can do on a day-to-day basis. And that is the part when I'm talking about I can do it in my own life. If I look at the world and it's awful, well, the world back then sounded like it was pretty awful too, with the Romans and everything going on. So I have to bring it down to what I can do day by day in my life.
It's probably much more sensible, Anne.
But that's why I think it's doable. That's why, and it's the only way I could do it, and is to day by day keep it, just act on it. That's the only way that makes sense to me. I can't take the big picture. I have to just do my daily life and what I can do in my community. And for me, it makes a lot of sense, the stuff there.
Yeah. And I agree. When you get right down to it, you only have control over what you do. That's all you really have control over on a good day. But, that's what you have to focus on.
Yeah. Go ahead, Chris.
Something I heard a long time ago, if you let more love in your life, then there's more love in the world. I found that actually very profound. And it's like the same as forgiveness, and if you can do that little bit, that is all you can do. You look at the Mideast or what's going on now in Israel, and it's like, where's the forgiveness? Where's the mediation? And where's the love? And Hamas has been planning this, I heard, for years. this is their end game, what they really wanted to do. So it's like, have they learned anything? It's crazy.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a choice. It's not a choice enough people are making.
Yeah, that's why I really appreciate Diane, that wisdom of, which I think is true with all the Gospels and Paul's letters, is what can I take from there that I need in my life. And for me, in the Sermon on the Mount, and it is really great teaching if we can hold it as, a beautiful set of instructions on how to live in this world. At its core, it is about being in right relationship with God, that we have a, a depth of connection with the divine, and that is unique to each one of us. That is unique in terms of our prayer practices, our spiritual practices, where we find our thin places, what words, what music, what environments we find where we connect closest with the divine within ourselves, within each other, within the world, within the cosmos. So it's at its core, it's that connection with the divine. And then out of that connection, how are we called then to be in right relationship with each other? Which, for Matthew, it's forgiveness. It is about finding ways to forgive and to love our enemies, right? We didn't spend a lot of time on that one, but that's a big teaching in the Sermon on the Mount. Being in right relationship with each other, being in right relationship with our community, which is about, how we share our resources, how we prioritize, what we spend our money on and our resources, our time, as well as our wealth, where they go and how they go. If we're in right relationship with God, then we go forth into the community with a generous spirit to share those resources, right? And then how do you be in right relationship with the world, which is the bigger one, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that's all there in the Sermon on the Mount. And if there's any part that I think when you're done with Matthew to keep in your back pocket and think when you struggle, I think the Sermon on the Mount is a really powerful 3 chapters to hold on to. There's a lot there. There's a lot of wisdom there. So. Okay. Any final thoughts? Next week, we're doing chapters 10 through 12.
These 3 chapters were beautifully written. I mean, for the first time in a gospel, I mean, I see the appreciation of Matthew from these 3 chapters. Beautifully, beautifully, beautifully written.
Matthew's the editor, right?
Right. And he only
mentioned all that stuff from Mark.
Right. He only mentioned Isaiah once, I think.
Yeah.
One time he quoted Isaiah. So, so it was just, it flowed. It was like poetry. It was just beautiful.
Yeah. I'm glad you had that experience. Go ahead, Bernie.
Back in chapter 6, talks about, you shouldn't pray in the middle of the church. You shouldn't stand up. You shouldn't. But someplace in the Bible, it says, don't hide your candle under a bushel.
Yeah, that's Matthew.
Where is that, and what's the difference?
I have to look it up, Bertie, but I think we've already passed it. It was, is it Matthew? It might be 6. It might be 5. I think it might be in Matthew 5.
Okay.
It's right next to the salt analogy.
But is he not contradicting himself in those between 5 and 6 then?
I don't think so. So say more. You think there's a contradiction between the hide your light and
hiding the light under the bushel and being outwardly profound about what you're doing?
No, I think the stuff that he's talking about, the piety practices, are he's basically calling out people who pray for attention, not from God. People who give for public acknowledgement. that their actions are not about being in right relationship for God. Their actions are about their ego, about getting praise from other people, about making themselves feel good. The don't cover yourself with the candle thing. That has more to do to say, be authentic to who you're called to be in this world. That's a little different than the piety stuff.
So I have a question.
Yeah.
Does that saying the Lord helps those who help themselves, is that any place in the Bible?
I have to check that one. I don't know if that one is.
Because it doesn't really jive very well with this, right?
What does that mean, even though?
I don't think it is.
I don't either.
Well, it means that you'll be more, well, I think it means that people the Lord helps are people that help themselves.
I'll check that one. I honestly, I do not think it is, Paul.
Oh, okay.
I can check it. The other thing I was going to show you all was, let me see if I can find it. It's not in 9. In 8. Yeah, let me see if I can find it. Oh, I can't find it. But there's one part in there that prosperity gospel preachers pull out all the time. And they say that this is the justification for prosperity gospel, which now that you know the whole context of Matthew, you should go, what? Prosperity gospel basically teaches that the gospels are all intended to get you rich, that you will prosper, and that you
prosper, right?
Yeah, you read the gospels from that lens, and you're basically looking for justification for personal wealth and success. And there's a piece in Matthew that's really often quoted by prosperity folks that we cover today that I can't pull up. I won't make you stay to do it, but that of course that wasn't either the ancient context or what probably Jesus or Matthew intended, but has really, really been subverted by prosperity gospels today. So I'll see if I can find it for you next week.
Okay.
Okay. Everybody good for today?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Thanks.
Have a good week and Happy New Year's, everyone.
Happy New Year.
Same to you.
See you next Tuesday.
Thank you.